All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to High Point Church as our Credible Christianity series continues. That's a little loud, isn't it? Could you do that, Jay? That's, I believe it's 23, and the volume seems higher than I thought. Everybody in Facebook land, pardon us. It's the only one that's on, probably 23. How's that? Yeah, that's a good speaker. That's nice. The equipment works. So, we're talking about the question of whether the New Testament has been changed. I'm going to go ahead and open in a prayer, and then we'll just have a discussion here. Father, thank you so much for today. I just pray that you will give us good information tonight and be glorified through everything we talk about. And I just pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Couple of points. One is that if you want some of the data from tonight's talk, most of it I have in a handout that I'm working off that is a Microsoft Word document, not copyrighted or anything. If you'd like to have that, go ahead and email me and I will get that to you. I'm going to focus on the New Testament tonight, but we could do this for the Old Testament. It's a little bit of a different study in some ways, but not much. We're focusing on the New Testament because the most important biblical data is in the New Testament. But if you'd like a similar handout for the Old Testament, I can give you that as well. I'm going to write down my email so that if you want these handouts and you'd like to dialogue more, that's the name Peter, J as in John, V-I-K at yahoo.com. Pretty simple and straightforward. So tonight we're talking about the question of whether the New Testament has been changed since it was originally written in the 1st century AD. When we say the 1st century, we mean basically between AD 1 and 100. And speaking very generously, all of the New Testament documents were written during that time. When I say generously, what I mean is most of them were written in a tighter time between, say, AD 49 probably and 90 to 95. So between then and now, have they been changed? And why anyone would ask that question is something we'll talk about in a few minutes, and we'll set this in context. But before I do that, I want to kind of give some assumptions that I'm working on here that maybe we can all agree on, maybe we can't, but they're not the subject of tonight to question these particular assumptions. So, here are some working assumptions. The very first talk we had was by Professor Blackburn, philosophy professor of San Diego Christian College, and his talk was on epistemology, or how do we know what we know, and he approached that from a philosophical perspective. We're going to kind of bypass some of those questions tonight. So I am assuming, for instance, that the universe exists and we're not in the Matrix. If you've seen the film The Matrix, this is where people are locked into a computer program they don't know they're plugged into, and so things like New Testament documents and omnibuses, none of that's real. Everybody's just in a pool of goo. We don't think that. At least I'm not working from that assumption tonight. I'm working from the assumption that we exist in a universe that actually exists, and that there are ancient documents that were written in ancient languages, and that further, it is possible to translate ancient languages. So if you have a problem with any of those premises, I would love to dialogue with you about that, but tonight is not the night to dialogue about that. So, let's just put this question in context. I'll just back up for a minute. Okay, well, no, I'll go straight to fact-bending and sensationalism. If your goal is to write a book that's going to be a New York Times bestseller and make it to the #1 best-selling list on Amazon, and your book is going to be related to the Bible, you've got a couple of options. You could predict the exact date when Jesus is going to return to Earth. And you will almost certainly be wrong, but you're going to sell books really well. You could tell people that God wants them to be rich, And, God's plan for their life is prosperity, and you're going to sell a lot of books, even though what you say is decidedly not true according to the scriptures. Or you could do something very skeptical and question the integrity, the truth of the Bible, or whether we can even know what it says. Something like that. And that's a pretty popular way to sell bestsellers. You try to invalidate the Bible, and that can be a pretty popular thing to do. And what happens there is a lot of fact bending. So let me suggest as a premise that it is possible to make statements that are in fact true, but you interpret them in such a way as to remove any sort of real, honest assessment of those facts from the scope of reality. You say something that, you share something, but you put it completely out of its context, whether it's scholarly context, whether it's immediate context, and you can really pull the wool over the eyes of people who don't know a lot about the subject. This gets done all the time, and I'm going to argue, not meaning to be disrespectful to some kind of famous Bible scholars, but there's some statements that are made that I think at best are quite irresponsible, and at worst are deliberate distortions of facts in order to create sensationalism, which tends to sell a lot of books, but kind of muddy things up for you. So here's a quote from a rather famous group of scholars, if you will. This is Robert Funk, Roy Hoover, and the Jesus Seminar in their title of their book, The Five Gospels. Now check it out. That is a sensationalized title. The Gospels, man, you get some sensationalism. These guys published this book, The Five Gospels, and we're like, wait a minute, I thought there were 4 Gospels. And I gotta read that. Now, sometime after they published this book, another fellow by the name of Dan Brown published this novel. He very openly admitted that it was a novel. It was fiction, right? But it was called The Da Vinci Code. Some of you may have read the book or seen the movie. And this old British professor in the Da Vinci Code says that there are more than 80 Gospels. And the poor skeptics were wondering, wait a minute, I thought the Jesus Seminar said there were 5, but now the Da Vinci Code says there's 80. And man, this gets a little out of hand. We're not going to talk too much tonight about what precisely a gospel is and the problem with that, or, the issues related to that. But this particular quote is directly related to what we're talking about. Every careful copyist, even careful copyists make mistakes, as every proofreader knows. So we will never be able to claim certain knowledge of exactly what the original text of any biblical writing was. The goal here is to kind of invalidate. Why say that the Bible is infallible or inerrant if we can't have any idea what it really said in the first place? That's kind of what these kind of quotes are geared at suggesting. Here's another one for you, and this is from a much more recent author, Bart Ehrman. Let me just talk a little bit about this, because Bart Ehrman largely is responsible for us having this discussion tonight. In 2005, Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament professor, he teaches New Testament studies at the University of North Carolina, and he studied at Princeton University. And he published this book in 2005 called Misquoting Jesus. That is a sensational title. And the premise of the title is that our modern-day New Testaments misquote Jesus, and the basis for what he's saying is that the Bible has been changed, so we don't really know what Jesus said. Periodically, I gotta get a little water. Many of you, as you dialogue with non-believing friends, you're going to hear them say, well, how can we really know what the Bible says because it's been changed? They may or may not know this, but they're leaning on Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman he sold what became a bestseller. It was at the top of the Amazon bestseller list, Misquoting Jesus, and this has really rocked a lot of people in terms of, can we really know what the New Testament originally said? 2 points about misquoting Jesus, quickly while we're talking about that. I'm not going to spend the bulk of tonight actually interacting with this book. Rather, I'm going to share some data that really puts the fact bending into an actual contextual light so that we can see that a quote like this one is really a misrepresentation of the facts. But in fairness to Dr. Ehrman, it wasn't his original intent to call the book Misquoting Jesus. The publishers insisted on that because they thought it would sell a bunch of books, which it did. But the ironic thing is the book says very little about the actual quotations from Jesus. It deals with what we call textual problems, and we'll define those in a minute, but the textual problems it deals with, most of them were not actually quotations from Jesus. So the title's kind of a mistaken title. The other thing is that the book has a subtitle, as you see, The Story of Who Changed the Bible and Why. Now, the entire premise of this book is that we can't know what the original documents really said. So far, so good? But if we know who changed the Bible and why, we necessarily would have to know what it originally said, or we couldn't make judgments about that. So it's kind of a silly subtitle, but it is the kind that is geared to sell books. So the question becomes, what do people like Bart Ehrman and the Jesus Seminar, what are the kind of actual facts that they present to kind of shock people into believing the New Testament can't be trusted? Here is a fact. There are 300,000 to 400,000 textual variants, and let me qualify that. When I say in the New Testament, here's what I mean. In the available documents, ancient documents of the New Testament that we have to work with. So let me give you a few points. You may not have realized this, but there were not leather-bound Bibles put out by a nice copier or printing press in the days of Jesus and the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John, some of the early church teachers like Polycarp, Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr, and others. They didn't have that. They had hand-copied copies of the New Testament. So here is a starting fact. We have the original documents. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all the way to Revelation. These documents were written sometime probably between around AD 49 and AD 95. The original documents were then, because the Christian church found them so important, tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of copies were made of them. Because Christianity was an illegal religion for the first 300 years of its existence. The Christian scriptures, the Roman Empire wanted to destroy them. Christians were like, we have to make as many copies as we can of these sacred writings, because it's actually an evidence of the fact that they believe these writings were the very word of God from the very beginning. They put their lives on the line to make these copies. Now later, after Constantine legalized Christianity, copies of the New Testament could be made in a little more comfort. But in the early days, you had to do this in secret, and you wanted to get out as many as you could, because whenever the Roman Empire found them, they wanted to destroy them. So we have these tons and tons of copies that were copied and copied and copied. And forgive me if I don't draw a pretty picture under each dot, but this happened again and again and again. And they would be taken to different geographical places and copied there. And we get all of these different manuscripts of the New Testament that are just like all over the place. Well, your Bible, how do you get it? A group of highly qualified scholars studied the available New Testament documents. They did a process called collating them. They exercised through a science called textual criticism, which we'll talk about. And they collated them, all of these, into a Greek New Testament, a published Greek New Testament. Something like the Nestle Aland 28 or the United Bible Studies, 5. I mean, these are different editions of these New Testaments. And then you have different groups of highly educated Bible translators. Probably the best English translations are usually done by a committee. So you have a committee of Bible translators that then translate the collated Greek New Testament into, in our case, pardon the writing, it's getting a little sloppy down there. Well, I guess it's a little sloppy up here too, so. And you've got your English Bible. So, Dr. Bart Ehrman and others are talking about these right here, the copies and the copies and the copies. Let's go back to Dr. Ehrman's quote. What good is it to say that the autographs of the originals were inspired? We don't have the originals. That is true. We only have error-written copies. That's a bit much. And the vast majority of these are century removed from the originals and different from them evidently in thousands of ways. There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, that is true, that there are more variations than there are words in the New Testament. That is not false information, but the light he puts this in makes it sound as though it were a big problem and as though this makes it impossible for us to really have any reasonable idea what the New Testament really said. Here's what's unfortunate about this, and in a way, quite frankly, even though Dr. Ehrman does a lot of fact-bending and sensationalizing here, in a way, he's done a favor to the Christian church, because here's what we've realized. People go to theological seminaries when they think they want to be a pastor or a Bible scholar or something like that, and they study the information that Bart Ehrman and others are bending and sensationalizing. But then they get their jobs in churches, and they never talk about this information like what we're doing now. They just sort of, okay, read your English Bible and I'll preach sermons from your English Bible, and we're all good. And then we have, poor people who sit in the pews, they listen to the Bible, believing the Bible is the very Word of God that drops from heaven in an English translation, probably the King James. And they have no idea about this process, so then you get the wool pulled over their eyes because you have facts that are no secret among evangelical scholars and really no threat to the Christian faith at all, but they're presented this way, and because pastors have done a very bad job of educating people, it can be confusing. Okay, so 300,000 to 400,000, that sounds pretty imposing. But let's talk a little bit, which Dr. Ehrman kind of didn't go into enough detail about this in the introduction to his book. What kind of variants are we talking about, and how significant are they? Again, this is before you could write something out on Microsoft Word and print out 100 copies that are precisely the same. This is before Xerox machines. This is before the printing press. And if you're going to make hand copies of documents, inevitably there's going to be some variation. I mean, that's just reality. When you compound the fact that a lot of times early New Testament documents were copied by people who didn't know New Testament Greek. This was written in a form of Greek called Koine Greek. They didn't know Greek all that well, they're just copying shapes. Inevitably, you're going to get variants. The original documents didn't have spaces between the words. That was one continuous script. That's how Greek was written. And you would just pick out the words by being able to, by sight. Inevitably, you're going to get some variants. That's not surprising when we're not talking about copy machines. So let's talk about what some of those were. I keep clicking the wrong thing. Well, as we get to that, let's talk about textual criticism. Textual criticism, this is a quote from a pretty good book, Reinventing Jesus by Wallace Sawyer and Komozewski. We have it back out there in one of the back pages if you'd like to read it. And they define textual criticism pretty well. In general, is the study of copies of any written document whose original is unknown or non-existent in order to determine the exact wording of the original. So looking at all these 3 to 400,000 textual variants, textual criticism is a science that analyzes these to try to get back to the original reading. And so when we talk about these 3 to 400,000 textual variants, what exactly are they? There's basically 3 categories of textual variant. I can count. It's my PowerPoint. Okay, go. I said 3, I meant 4. 4 categories of textual variant. And probably a few more because some of these are kind of merged together, but they fit the broad category. We have spelling differences and nonsense errors. We have differences that do not affect translation or that involve synonyms. We have meaningful variants that are not viable, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And then we have variants that are meaningful and viable. Well, let's talk about each of these in turn, actually. So, for instance, in the spelling difference or nonsense errors, here's an example of a spelling difference. This is the name John in the Greek New Testament. There's a lot of Johns in the New Testament. There's John the Baptist, there's John the Apostle, right? So the name John shows up pretty often. And those V-looking things, you see like what looks like 2 V's up there, but down there it looks like 1 V. That's the Greek letter nu. And the Greek letter nu is like an English in. So that's the in John, right? Phonics in Greek. Sometimes, oh my goodness, this is going to destroy your Christian faith. Sometimes the name John was written with 1 nu, and sometimes it was written with 2 nus. And sometimes we have this textual variant where in one manuscript there will be 1 nu in John's name, and in another there will be 2 nus. It means John. It's not a real issue. So spelling differences is one category. Another category is nonsense errors. There are some words in the Greek New Testament that look kind of similar in some ways, and so a scribe, you can imagine what it'd be like. You're looking back and forth from one written document to a written document, maybe by candlelight, or torchlight. You're writing another document. You're going back and forth, and occasionally you have slippery eyes and things like this, and you accidentally copy the wrong word. The word kai, which means and in New Testament Greek, starts with a kappa, looks like a K. The word kurios translates as Lord, and it also begins with a kappa. So a scribe might accidentally write kai when he meant to write kurios. And so you're reading in Romans 10:9, and it says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So does that some kind of textual variant that we need to really think through our theology? And what does it mean? I knew Jesus is Lord, but what does it mean that Jesus is and? Of course not. All right? The word kai was accidentally written instead of kurios. There's no question about that. It is a clear nonsense error. And unless you think that the original authors were deliberately writing nonsense, we can rule out that error just like that. Well over 50% of those 300,000 to 400,000 textual variants, well over 50% of those are spelling differences and nonsense errors. So already we're talking about things that really make no real difference in our Greek New Testament. I gotta get this down. There we go. There are differences that do not affect translation. If you don't have any background in New Testament Greek, this is a little harder for you to understand, but let me do the best I can to explain it. In English, which is what most of us read and write in, word order is everything. You put together a sentence with word order, and if you put the words in the wrong order, it throws everything out. Greek is a language that has conjugations of verbs and cases and nouns. We don't have that in English. Because of that, word order in New Testament Greek, Word order in New Testament Greek, in a lot of sentences, words can come in almost any order. And you can tell what function they have in a sentence by the endings of the word. The verb endings, the noun endings, the adjective endings, etc. There is some significance to word order, but it's nothing like the importance of word order in English. The point being, if you rearrange the order of the words, if you rearrange the order of two words, that counts as a textual variant. But it doesn't affect English translation at all. It doesn't affect the meaning at all, or at least very little. Let me give you an example up here on the board. I'll give you an example of something in a sec on the PowerPoint. All right. In John 1:1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So, what you don't know is in the Greek text, let me just focus in on the phrase, "and the Word was God." And that means okay. But see, this is the word for God, and this is the word for the Word. And this here is the word for was, and you will note that in the Greek text, God here comes before the Word. But that doesn't translate as the Word, as God was the Word. It translates as the Word was God. Well, how do you know, Pete? Because this little doohickey right here is called an article, and the article tells me that this is the subject of the verb, which means that this is what we call the predicate. So, that's very straightforward. That is not debated. But God comes first because it's in what they call the emphatic position. It's emphasizing the importance of God. It's like saying, instead of just saying, like, it's not saying the Word was God, it's like saying the Word was God, kind of. And that's about the best way I can bring that out in English. So we call it the emphatic position, but the English translation wouldn't be any different if it were pardon my teacher worked really hard on my penmanship when I was in third grade, and poor lady, Mrs. Cantrell, if you're out there watching this, I'm really sorry. Okay. So there's a lot of differences that do not affect translation that account for tons and tons and tons of these 300,000 to 400,000 textual variants. And an example of this would be, we have, let's just take an English phrase, like an English sentence like Jesus loves Paul. And we've got a handful of words here, and believe it or not, I don't want to go through, for time's sake, I don't want to go through each of these meticulously, plus I'm going to put you to sleep if I explain the exact difference between each sentence. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, Steve, that one little English sentence can translate, that you can write the same exact English sentence in New Testament Greek in 7 different ways? No! You can write it in 16 different ways, and it translates the exact same way in English. So when we have things like that little, you can see this thing I call the article. You can see how sometimes a noun will have the article, sometimes it won't. For instance, you take a name like Jesus. If you write the name Jesus with the article, how would we translate that? Jesus. But if we got rid of the article, we just wrote the Greek name Jesus, how would we translate that? Jesus, if instead of Jesus we made it Paul, we could write Paulos, and then we get rid of the article, and that translates as Paul. We get rid of the article and it still translates as Paul. When we know which usually names the subject of the sentence, whereas the word Paul is in what's called the accusative case, which usually names the direct object of the sentence, and the verb can come first, last, or somewhere in between. You put all that together, and as I say, one sentence, one way we can say this in English, but 16 different ways it could be written in New Testament Greek. Now, if we have all of these 17 or all these 16 variants, all these 16 textual variants on one phrase, every single person who ever translated this phrase into English would translate it as Jesus loves Paul, and we wouldn't have nothing to worry about, nothing to get our faith rocked about. You know, it's not like, I don't know, nobody's going to get Jesus loves Satan out of this or something. So, all right. Differences involving synonyms. So we have differences in spelling, nonsense errors, differences of word order, and sometimes we have synonyms. So, for example, there might be a manuscript that says, Jesus said, whereas another manuscript says, the Lord said, but in context, we know it's Jesus, because Jesus is the one that's been talking for like 65 verses already, right? So, there's no great confusion here, there's no great question, it doesn't rock anything in particular, we know who said it, if the word Jesus is used, or kurios, and you can well imagine how a tired scribe writing on documents, sweaty eyes and stuff, I mean, he's used to calling Jesus, he's used to calling Jesus the Lord, he might make a mistake like that, but it doesn't, so it can affect translation, but it doesn't affect meaning, all right? Because whether or not you really genuinely believe that Jesus is the Lord, that's definitely the perspective of the New Testament. All right, couple more categories. Let's see. I think I got this down. No, I don't. I blame you. There are what we call meaningful variants that are not viable. I gotta put like some air quotes around meaningful here, all right? Because this particular variant's like it really ain't all that meaningful. But what we mean is they would change the meaning, or at least the translation, a little bit. There might be more words. But when we say they're not viable, what we mean is they don't have good textual evidence. I'll talk a little bit more about textual evidence and weighty evidence versus non-weighty evidence, but they're either very rare variants or they're an obvious scribal mistake or something like that. They don't have a very good case that can be made that they are the original reading. So for instance, in Matthew 11:9, it says the Pharisees asked Jesus' disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But in Luke 5:30, it says, "Why does your teacher eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And that's what we call a synoptic difference. We have one gospel says eat, the other gospel says eat and drink. So, but some scribes, when they were copying Matthew, they may have also copied the Gospel of Luke like 50 times, right? And so they sort of have a lot of, I mean, you can imagine how well you would get to know this material if you're copying it day after day after day, assuming you can actually read Greek. So, a scribe might accidentally add in and drink into Matthew. Why does your teacher eat and drink? Even though Matthew didn't write the and drink part, Luke mentioned that. Now, that's probably, the Pharisees probably mentioned and drink, and, Matthew just for, whatever reasons, he was, for cutting space or something, left that part out. However that may be, that would change the translation of Matthew's gospel a little bit, but it's very, very weakly attested to. Now, of course, it doesn't change our theology of anything, because one of the Synoptic Gospels says it anyway. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And two, whether the Pharisees asked Jesus why Jesus' disciples eat or eat and drink, it really doesn't change the overall meaning of their question all that much. The point here is some textual variants, some readings are just not very likely to the original, even if they would have changed the meaning just a little bit. All right. The last category is what we would call variants that are viable and they could have some bearing on New Testament meaning. Let me just take a step back. Before we get to variants that are meaningful and viable, the first three categories, which is spelling differences and nonsense, errors, differences of word order, synonyms, and meaningful variants that are not viable, we've just covered well over 90% of the textual variants. Okay, so we've covered almost all of the textual variants are this sort of thing. They just don't make any real material difference. There are a few variants that are, as I said, meaningful and viable. And what I mean is that they involve a slight change in meaning, and they're both well attested. There's really good manuscript evidence for both. In fact, sometimes the manuscript evidence will be split down the middle, so that when textual critics look at this, they have to make what's called a textual decision, and it's a little harder to be as sure what the first meaning was. So, probably one of the most difficult textual variants is in Romans 5:1. Get ready, I hope your faith can handle this. I'm joking. Okay, so Romans 5:1 says, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. Pretty exciting. Amen. See it over. But that would be the top reading there. Ekamen. You see the O-looking thing in Greek, that's called an omicron, and that's pronounced ekamen, and that's what's called a present active indicative verb, which would mean we have peace with God. But somewhere along the line, assuming that was the correct reading, somewhere along the line, a tired scribe accidentally wrote an omega, that's the W-looking thing, instead of an omicron. An omicron makes a short O sound like up. An omega makes a long O sound like O. Ekamen would mean we have peace, whereas ekomen would mean, well, you haven't. Let us have peace with God. So then what do? The manuscript evidence is kind of split down the middle. This is where a good textual critic will think, what is the Apostle Paul more likely to say here? Would he be more likely to say, we have peace with God, or would he say, let us? Be more likely to say, let us have peace with God? Let me make an observation before we even do our little textual criticism work. There's not some kind of threat to the Christian faith if Paul said, we have peace with God, or let us have peace with God, all right? The Apostle Paul, in his writings, if you're familiar with his writings at all, you know that he is notorious for sometimes making statements of reality about what it means to be a Christian, whereas at other times he encourages people to, shall we say, embrace the realities. So, for instance, in, I believe it's the book of Galatians, should have looked this up, but oh well, you can. I believe it's in Galatians where he talks about, he says, we have put on the new man. But then I think it's in Colossians and he says, as a command, put on the new man. And you're like, well, gee, Mr. Apostle Paul, have we already put on the new man, or are we supposed to put on the new man? On the one hand, he's talking about a reality of benefits we have in Christ. On the other hand, he's talking about kind of laying hold of the benefits you already have. But either way, it's not a contradiction. So whether Paul had written, we have peace, or let us have peace, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. All it really makes a difference is what exactly Paul is saying in that exact verse. Now, most textual critics are going to favor the top reading, we have peace with God, because that fits Paul's, what we call his broader theology of salvation in Romans, that we already have peace with God. But the point I'm making is that that's probably about as tough as a textual problem gets, and it doesn't seriously rot anything about Christian belief. In fact, many have said, and they are right, there's not a single textual variant that affects a single major Christian doctrine. There is no major Christian doctrine that's affected by a textual variant. So, textual, I don't want you to misunderstand here. Textual criticism is very, very important. It's very important, and frankly, the Christian church doesn't give it the importance it is due. But if you're saying that textual criticism somehow makes it so we can't understand what the original documents really said, I think Shakespeare would say that is kind of much ado about nothing. We have, and here we're talking about Greek manuscripts. There's other things like translations, early Latin translations, early Ethiopic translations, early, I don't know, any number of other different languages that I'm blanking out on right now. It happens. But, there's all of these early translations. From the very earliest days, the New Testament was translated into other languages. But here we're just talking about Greek manuscripts. There are over 5,700 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament that these textual critics are working with. Now, even with all of those 300,000 to 400,000 variants, even working all that data in, this puts it in context. The available Greek manuscripts still agree 98%. This is an estimate, certainly, but this is a scholarly estimate that when you put all the manuscripts together, you look at all the differences, there's still 98% unanimity. So that's pretty good to start with. Even before we had to make the tough textual criticism decisions, we've got 98% agreement. Now, using the science of textual criticism and ruling out the highly unlikely readings, we can reconstruct the original documents of the New Testament with 99% certainty. We can be, using the methods of textual criticism, we can be over 99% certain what the original text said, which is really quite a far cry from this business of how can we possibly know what the New Testament originally said. Now there's another important point, another important place we have to go here. Because if we're going to say we can have no idea what the New Testament originally said because of the existence of textual variants and the distance of time between the original writing and some of the copies, we're going to have to be fair, and we're going to have to not allow other disciplines to put the New Testament in a category of specialty. Here's what I mean. When all of you went to school, grade school, middle school, high school, whatever the case may be, you probably had a history class, and there were probably history books, and you probably had one class on American history and one class on world history. Sound familiar? Probably several of each, right? And when you had the class on world history, some of the things they talked about was like ancient history, like the ancient Greeks, the ancient Persians, the ancient Romans, right? Stuff like that. All of that historical data rests on ancient documents that are much, much, much more poorly attested than the New Testament. The New Testament is the best attested ancient document anywhere in the history of the world, and this isn't debated. This is not a debated point. I'll give you some hard facts and data to back this up, but here's the point. So if you're really going to insist that we can't have any idea what the New Testament really said, then we really can't have any idea about anything that ever happened in ancient history. All right? I mean, don't talk about Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Don't talk about Alexander the Great invading India. All right? Don't talk about even things like Attila the Hun. In fact, any document that precedes the printing press, you're dealing with textual variants. And with ancient documents, you're dealing with huge gaps and very, very little textual data. I was just reading Homer lately. Homer is an ancient Greek poet. He wrote a couple of famous books called the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, one important point of disclosure, I wasn't in that movie. That's an actor named Brad Pitt, and a lot of people get confused about that. I'm just kidding. Okay, but Troy is very, 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 very loosely based on the Iliad. But here's the point about the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's poetry, which very few people think is, strictly speaking, historical narrative, but nobody says, we can't have any idea what Homer really wrote. Everybody that I've ever heard of accepts that these poems go back to a writer in roughly about 800 BC. Pretty ancient document, but let's compare the New Testament with some other ancient documents and see how it adds up. Here's a few examples. And so I just mentioned Homer. Homer was a pretty well-known and respected writer in the ancient world. So we've got about 643 manuscripts, some of them fragments, some of them complete, to tell us what Homer wrote in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, Homer was probably, I said 800, Homer was probably actually writing about 900 BC, so a good long time ago. About, roughly, within 1,000 years of when King David was ruling in Jerusalem. The earliest copies we have were copied in 400 BC, so we're talking about a 500-year gap. All right, and we've got 643 manuscripts to work with, which is a pretty good attestation. Homer isn't bad as ancient documents go, but if we can't know what was really written in the New Testament, and we got over 5,700 copies, and it's written, our earliest copies go within give or take 30 to 40 years of the original writing, man, we can't know anything about ancient history. Plato, the famous philosopher. You heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, morons, right? Plato is one of the most influential writers of all time. He was writing in about 380 BC. The earliest documents we have of Plato come from 900 AD. I mean, do the math on that gap. And we have all of 7 of them, and nobody's saying, how do we know what Plato really wrote? It's well over 1,000 years of difference there. This doesn't happen. We go down the line and look at all of these. Aristotle, again, one of the most influential writers in history. Again, far more than a 1,000-year gap, not very many copies, and nobody's saying, do we really know what Aristotle wrote? Caesar, similar situation. And then these 5 guys down here are historians. Now, almost everything you ever learned about ancient history comes from those 5 guys up there, all right? Almost all the data in your history books growing up came from those 5 sources, those 5 historians. And so if we're going to throw out the New Testament as we can have any idea what it originally said, we have to throw all of that stuff out. And it's really kind of silly to talk about being able to know what anybody originally wrote unless we have the original document or it was put into a printing press in its original copy. So really, the New Testament, as I say, is by far the best attested set of documents from the ancient world, par excellence, hands down. One of my Greek professors, we had a quote from him earlier, Dan Walls, often likes to say that we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the New Testament attestation. There's nothing like it anywhere in the ancient world. Here's another chart. Some of you, I had the previous slide because, I know not everyone can see that well. And I borrowed this card from somebody else. So you can't see that, but that gives even more data, even more ancient writings than I had on the previous one. And just as I say, no comparison. Now, I do want to make an important point before we go on. Whether we're talking about history or whether we're talking about doctrine and theology, I believe that the New Testament is true. But whether the New Testament is true and whether we can know what the original writers wrote, that is a different question. So I just want to say that and be fair. The fact that we can know what the original New Testament writers wrote, that doesn't necessarily make it true any more than the fact that we can know what Plato wrote would, in fact, make it true. I believe with all my heart that the New Testament is true, and we're going to talk about things like historical reliability in the Bible next week, and things like miracles and stuff, and dialogue about all of that. But for now, from this week, let me just say, the main issue is that there is this claim floating around out there that it's not possible to know what the New Testament authors really wrote. And while we freely acknowledge that whether it's true might be another issue, that is just a ludicrous thing to say in light of the literary context, in light of the documentary data that we're working with. And these aren't my factors here. I mean, these are the facts and data that you're going to find from just about any resource you read on these matters. A couple of significant witnesses, just to kind of whet your appetite or let you know what we're dealing with. That is a picture of P52, which stands for Papyrus 52. So that's a fragment, the earliest fragment we have of the Gospel of John. And so far, this is the most significant authenticated New Testament fragment. Authenticated means that it has been agreed upon by scholars through the dating methods that are used for these things, where P52 reaches back to. And P52, the earliest validated Greek manuscript of the New Testament, contains a fragment of John's Gospel, John 18:31 to 33, and 37 to 38. This document dates between AD 100 and 150. Most scholars are going to put it, most scholars have worked with textual criticism, we're going to put P52 at about AD 125. You know, kind of a golden mean, a middle date there between 100 to 150. So that's the consensus scholarly estimate. The consensus on when the Gospel of John was written was sometime around AD 90. Some people are going to date it a little earlier than that, in the 70s. Some people might date it as late as 95. But the consensus for dating the Gospel of John is about AD 90. Just for fun, not all that long ago, skeptics of the New Testament wanted to say that John was like the least historically reliable of the Gospels, and a lot of people used to want to say, based on what they consider to be internal evidences and things, that the Gospel of John was written in like 150 AD. And you'll still hear that occasionally. That will still be taught in an occasional university class or something, which is really funny, because it's really funny that a document that was written in about 120, that we have an actual document that dates at about 125, but you got people saying it was written in 150. Okay, and we want to note that P52, like most of the papyri in the New Testament, it was discovered in Egypt, and airplanes and trains and stuff didn't really exist around that time. And so, for a manuscript to be discovered, it shows how early the manuscript was copied and distributed, because within roughly, under 30 years of being written, it had made its way from Israel all the way, not Israel, but Asia Minor, all the way over to Egypt. It was written in Asia Minor, what they would call Asia, what we today would call Turkey, probably in Ephesus. It shows how important these documents were, that it would have been carried that far, that fast. But to have a document, an ancient document, we have actual hard evidence of within 30 years, again, nothing else like that in the ancient world. Some real significant stuff. A couple of other significant witnesses. We're not going to go into great detail on all the New Testament witnesses, and I know that text is a little small for some of you. Sorry. But these are some of the fragments we're dealing with, some of the earliest documentary evidence of the New Testament. And you can see that these dates, the earliest goes to 125 AD, the next would be 150 to 200, a few 150 to 200. We have a big group of documents that are called the Chester Beatty Papyri. And you see all of these different sections of the New Testament that were discovered in Egypt. This Chester Beatty Papyri, that is a huge amount of New Testament information that is attested around 200 AD. That is some very, very early documentary evidence as history goes. Bodger Papyrus and others. So, this is just kind of scratching the surface of some of the data we have. But again, suffice it to say, the attestation we have of the reliable transmission of the New Testament, there's just not anything like it in history.
I want to interject with a question.
Yeah, please.
So, I'm happy with everything you're saying. My question that I have, that I've not heard from others, but I'm guessing they thought about this, is, if we take John the Apostle here, the most important part of his whole life was 3 years he was with Jesus, and yet it took him nearly 60 years to actually document that most important activity.
Excellent.
Tell me why did it take him so long? Because there's probably people that believe that things have been forgotten, certainly literal
right.
statements and whatnot. Talk about that.
No, it's a very good question. And I do want to say, we are going to have a Q&A time, and if you have questions, you may as well ask them, because I have covered the bulk of what we have to talk about. My next section would be about how do they do textual criticism, which is probably a little bit. So if we get to that, we get to it. But if not, and you have questions like this, they're good ones. And obviously, let me say at the outset, Randy, that number one, I can't give an inerrant answer to that, of course, but I do think that there's a significant reason for that. And even all of the Gospels, we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and depending, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call the Synoptic Gospels, which would have been written somewhere probably between AD 60 and 70. Some people are going to want to stretch that into the 70s, which really doesn't make that big of a difference. But so even there, we have, if you take the traditional date that Jesus rose from the dead around AD 33, and with ancient dates like that, we need to give it some flex. But assuming something like an AD 33 date for Jesus rising from the dead, if the earliest of the Gospels was probably not written, some people might date Matthew or Mark as early as 55. Most people think sometime in the 60s for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why did they wait a couple of decades, and why did John wait so many decades? And let me mention a couple of important points on this. I also want to mention that very question is engaged if you want a more thorough treatment. I quoted from this book earlier, and I have it on the back table if anyone wants to borrow it. Reinventing Jesus? Question mark. All right, that's the title of the book, and it's a good one. The first thing we want to look at is when, assuming that the Gospels do give us a record of what actually happened, which I do think is true, but assuming that that's the case, what did Jesus tell them to do? He didn't say, hey, check it, guys. I want you to sit down and write a bunch of documents, and chronicle what happened. He never gave them a command like that. What he did command them to is to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. Or go and make disciples of all nations. They were given a mission, or what we sometimes call a commission, and it wasn't that. So they went around the world and started sharing what they consider to be the good news about Jesus. Now, as you can well imagine, the people who had walked with Jesus, like Peter, for instance, what Jesus was like, this would have been really important information that people would have wanted to know. You know, what Jesus did, what he was like, they probably would have been sharing, they certainly would have been sharing this information all over the place, because this is what everybody would have wanted to know. It seems that at a later time, starting with the Synoptics and all, and I'll come to John and what was going on there in a minute, but at a later time, it seems like they wanted to, you know, sit down and write out the story to make sure that it didn't get lost, because they ain't going to live forever. But the reason they didn't sit down and do that right away is because they had a mission, and it wasn't that. The reason this actually, in a sense, works in the favor of those of us who believe that the Gospels are historically reliable is those who are going to question the historical reliability of the Gospels are going to say, this was so long after the fact, people made up all this stuff about the life of Jesus, and they just wrote it down, and then all of a sudden everybody believed it. But it was so long after the fact that, that would have gotten muddied, it would have gotten confused. But here's the thing about that. If the apostles had gone throughout the ancient world, and we know that they did, because we know, whatever you think about what happened, whether you think the book of Acts gives us historically reliable information, no historian is going to deny that by the end of the 1st century AD, Christianity is all over the place. You can't deny it. That is just the fact. When they went around the world disseminating this information in the early days after Jesus rose from the dead, if they come back 20, 30 years later and they start writing down in documents a completely different story, if they're writing something different in the document than what they told people when they first went out to share the good news, people are going to notice that. That's going to give them some accountability. Obviously, we don't know exactly what was done and said, but that's something that people will notice. So I think that really that can work in our favor in terms of historical reliability. But in one sense, their immediate job given by Christ was to, spread a message rather than write documents. The other thing I want to say about the Gospel of John, if most scholars who talk about the Gospel of John are correct, the author, which I believe was the historical Apostle John, was doing ministry in Ephesus, which was the capital city of Roman Asia or Asia Minor. And why in AD 90, when he's getting to be a pretty old man and close to death, why did he suddenly want to write this gospel? Why did he suddenly feel a need to write this gospel? I think in his case, as is so often the case, his gospel was written to refute false claims about Jesus. Because as Christianity went on, one of the things you always see in the New Testament is these warnings about false teachers, false apostles, all of this stuff. And it seems to me, and there's other scholars like Richard Longnecker and D.A. Carson and others who would validate me on this, it seems like as false teaching spread, and you get these people, as the other apostles are dying, and John is the last living apostle, and you have these people that kind of came with this story. Hey, those guys who were supposed to be the apostles, what they said about Jesus, that's not the real story. I've got the real story for it. So, in one sense, I think John was writing to refute that stuff. And so the occasion was, we have false claims about Jesus, that the reason he felt the need to write a gospel was because of these false claims that are being made. Along with that, I think we probably want to note that there were if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you read the Gospel of John, you find that the Gospel of John, in some ways, is very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not contradictory, but it's very different. You get a lot of information that you don't get in the other three, and you get a lot of information in the other three that you don't get in the Gospel of John. There were well-known Christian doctrines that, say, for instance, the Apostle Paul teaches in Romans, in Galatians, And incidentally, Paul's letters, almost all of them were written before the Gospels. And that's not a debated point. Your New Testament isn't in chronological order. Just about all of Paul's letters were written before the Gospels. It also seems like at least possible that some people were, because of the material that was recorded by the writers of the Synoptic Gospels that was written for a certain purpose, there are certain things you find in, say, Paul's letters and other New Testament letters that you don't really see that doctrine in the Synoptic Gospels. And so I suspect there were some people that were like, well, if this doctrine is true, why don't we see it? Or why didn't Jesus say it? So I think in part the Apostle John might have been writing to say, well, hey, he actually did, and I was there. So it's a good question, and I mean, that would be my answer to this. Follow up, or if there's any other questions from anybody else.
Ask a follow-up?
Oh, please.
Would you be comfortable saying that because the Gospels are divinely inspired, God made sure nothing was lost in that time span?
I would say that, and I do want to acknowledge freely. I'm not coming at this unbiased. Nobody really is, but let me say freely that I'm not. I have a faith commitment to the truth of Scripture, and I say that without apology and without fogging it up. I do believe the Bible is the Word of God, and we can talk about that. What we're dealing with primarily tonight is engaging this claim that the writings have been changed, which is easily refutable in terms of hard data. Whether the Bible is actually the Word of God, I believe that's completely true, and I even believe that we could give strong evidences to that, but that is on some level of faith commitment. And I mean, the Bible calls us to faith, so I don't see how that's a problem. We'll let Jay answer in a minute, but I do want to mention that. I mean, almost everything you believe because you're trusting what you consider to be a credible source of information. Go ahead, Jay.
Oh, I was just going to read Luke's prologue and partial answer to Randy's question, if I may.
Oh, please.
Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. Luke 1:1-4.
Yes, and so definitely, and we're going to talk about this next week. Luke has been examined by very credible historians in terms of his facts and data. Not necessarily, we're not talking about whether by believing Jesus you have life in his name, but things like, who was, the procurator in what province and things like that. He's been found to be very historically accurate as far as where his history and the Bible overlap. But so important stuff. One more thing I do want to talk about, because it takes us back to our buddy Bart Ehrman, and I just think it's an important thing. When Dr. Bart Ehrman is asked, well, give us an example of a questionable text that might not have been original. He usually goes to John 7:53 to 8:11, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And he might also go to Mark 16:9-20, which is the longer ending of Mark. Here, he provides the scholarly evidence that these particular sections were probably not part of the original New Testament documents. Therefore, how can we possibly know what the New Testament really said? Because we have these two sections. You can work through the data on this and work out what you think about this, but let me just say this. Among evangelical, Bible-believing, Bible-thumping scholars, that the pedigree of these passages is questionable is not a secret. This has been known for hundreds of years. If you went to any Bible program, any master's program in biblical studies where they actually worked in New Testament Greek and taught textual criticism at all, they would tell you that most scholars don't think these were part of the original documents of the New Testament. There are some who think they were, but most think they don't. When I say most, I'm talking about evangelical scholars, not just, what we call higher critics or something like that. So that's not a big, dark, dirty secret. The problem is that these do appear in printed editions of the New Testament, and in fact, I would say that almost any of your Bible, almost any Bible that any of you have, has a footnote that tells you, it'll say something to the effect of, this section is not in the earliest and best manuscripts. Almost any of your Bibles say that. On one level, it might be a little bit confusing because the translators usually do put them in there, even though those very translators don't think they were original, and so that's a little confusing. On the other hand, just to defend the translators a little bit, it might not be their fault that, people aren't reading the footnote. So the longer ending of Mark, or the story of the woman caught in adultery, that is a great story. One of the reasons I think that Christians tend to want John 7:53 to 8:11 to be part of the original text because it's such a wonderful story. And you may study the data and find that you disagree with what we call a scholarly consensus. But if you read somebody like Dr. Bart Ehrman saying that, well, that wasn't part of the original text, or at least there's not early attestation of it, yeah, there's not. Evangelical scholars have said that for, like I said, a very, very long time. For instance, the king of the fundamentalists, the king of the study Bibles, the original study Bible was good old, the original Scofield study Bible in 1909. C.I. Scofield, and there's been several editions of the Scofield Study Bible, but this was the original. And Dr. Scofield was not a formally trained theologian. If you know anything about the Scofield Bible, and in my family, like our big reward when we read through the Bible for the first time, in King James, of course, my parents would buy us our own leather-bound Scofield reference Bible. So this is like the king of the fundamentalist study Bibles, and in 1909, Dr. Scofield, honorary Dr. Scofield, we should know, no formal biblical training, while he did himself think these were original, even he, in 1909, said, they're not in the most ancient manuscripts. So this wasn't a secret, even C.I. Scofield knew that. The passage from verse 9 to the end, this is about the longer ending of Mark, is not found in the two most ancient manuscripts, the Sinaitic and the Vatican. Now, there's a little more data than that, but this is what Dr. Scofield was working with. Then you can read the rest. And then John 7:53 to 8:11 is not found in some of the most ancient manuscripts. But Dr. Scofield did still think it was original, and he did because in the 4th century, 300 years later, St. Augustine thought so. Fair enough. I'm not necessarily saying with certainty that those weren't part of the original New Testament. It's just important that we understand that when a higher critic or somebody who's trying to shape your faith in the New Testament, they come at you with this as evidence that we can't know what the New Testament really said because those sections weren't in the earliest manuscripts. Almost everybody who's ever studied Greek in a theological seminary or Bible college knows that, and it's a footnote in almost every English Bible you'll read. Not necessarily the one you get at the 99-cent store, okay? But the rest of them are probably going to have that data. So this is what I say about fact bending. Dr. Ehrman will talk about passages like these as though that is like, standard fare. And it's just quite silly. All right, I don't have any more slides I need to talk about. So if there's more questions, I'm happy to answer them, and then I'll close with some well thought out comments. Go ahead.
So I missed the first part, so I didn't cover it earlier. But did you mention anything about canonization or how we can trust, like where other pieces obviously written?
Oh yeah, the canon. And it wouldn't hurt hurt for us to have a session on the canon. I don't have it in the schedule, so maybe we can talk about whether we want to add on a couple of nights or whether we want to do something else. That is a really good question, Phil, about how do we get the biblical canon? Did the right books get in the canon? I erased my email, but if you want it, I have business cards in the back as well. Pick one up, it's got my email on it. My fallback is always to say I have some handouts on that I'd love to give, but for now, let me say a couple of things about the process of canonization. You get, like in the Da Vinci Code and from other people, you get this idea that there's these secret gospels, these 80 secret gospels, and these were all these Christian gospels, and then in the days of Constantine, a lot of people want to say it in the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea didn't say a word. I think in the Da Vinci Code they say that the canon was determined at the Council of Nicaea. They didn't even discuss that at Nicaea. Nicaea was about the Trinity, okay? They were talking about the Trinity and the deity of Christ. They weren't talking about canonization. Canonization was a process to grossly oversimplify. You see a very, 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 in the New Testament particularly, because we're talking about the Old Testament is its own story, and there's good evidence there as well, but you see a very, very, very steady stream from the very beginning of the Christian church recognizing the New Testament canon as we have it as Christian scripture. There's a few books that we call the anti-legomena, which means those words that were spoken against, as opposed to the homo-legomena, which means those that were not spoken against. But you have a lot of books that it was never questioned whether they were of divine inspiration. The rest of them, the church examined them carefully and thought they were inspired. But if you look, I could show you if I had the right PowerPoint up here. I have one, it's just not written in here. I can show you a very steady stream of Christians from the very beginning, as soon as people were talking about what books belong, showing what are the books that the church has always recognized as being the inspired books of the New Testament. Now, you'll occasionally when I show you those slides, you occasionally see a name of a book that didn't make the cut in the long run, that somebody thought, forget the name of the guy I'm thinking of, but anyway, somebody didn't think this book, or thought a book should be in there that wasn't, but you're not going to find titles like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, all these things that supposedly, the Jesus Seminar and others and Dan Brown would say, oh, these are the books that the church was conspiring to keep out. You're not going to find those in any of these ancient canons. You'll find a couple of things like, say, the Didache, which means the teaching, or the Shepherd of Hermas. The church, some early church teachers thought, well, maybe the Shepherd of Hermas belongs in the Bible, and the church as a whole rejected it. But, all of this business of the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, those weren't really part of the discussion, really, ever. They were like documents that came out of what we would call something like cults, and they were, all of them were written in like AD 150 and after, and it's like not like anybody didn't know this. So it's really fun nowadays to act like there was this conspiracy theory and all of these documents that had all this secret information were kept secret by the church. But the other thing is, almost any of those documents you can find on a Google search and read. And I'd say that if you're wondering whether the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas is really scripture, reading it is usually a pretty quick and easy way to cure you of that. Here's kind of the story you get a lot of times in these other Gospels and other New Testament books. Here's the story our higher critic friends will want to tell you. Well, originally the church had an idea of a more human Jesus and a more humane Jesus. A Jesus who didn't really talk about hell, a Jesus who had a lot more respect for women, a Jesus who was much more human. these secret gospels, and you can read them, they didn't really emphasize the humanity of Jesus. They denied the humanity of Jesus. They explicitly denied the humanity of Jesus, and they are, how shall I say, anything but flattering to women. So the Gospel of Thomas, right? When Robert Funk over in the Jesus Seminar talking about the 5 Gospels, they're saying the Gospel of Thomas is number 5. That was written in Coptic. That was the language I couldn't think of earlier. And it was written like in the second half of the 2nd century. But the Gospel of Thomas ends with this statement where Peter asks Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, Lord, he points to Mary and he says, well, what about her? Can she go into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus responds, the Gospel of Thomas with this great feminist Jesus says, well, Peter, women can't go to heaven, but I'll make her male, and then she can get into heaven. And that's how the Gospel of Thomas ends. So if you read the commentary note in the 5 Gospels, they're going to tell you, well, this was probably a later edition. This wasn't part of the original document. There's no textual evidence for that. There's no missing part of the Gospel of Thomas. There's no textual indentation that would suggest that this was a later edition. And these secret Gospels are riddled with this kind of stuff. So, anyway, as far as the canonization process and whether the right books got into the New Testament, that is a great subject that I'd love to chat about it. Maybe. I don't know, we can talk about it. Maybe we need to do a session on that. It'd be fun. I have notes already, so that's always nice. What else?
Can you talk about how much biblical and non-biblical scholars agree on the Trinity? Because I know that in the Old Testament there's disagreement over some passages.
Yes.
Because it has to do with prophecy. And so, some people will say it was dated later so that
Right. And I do want to say, Miriam, as far as some of that Old Testament stuff, we're going to talk about a little bit of that next week because it is very valuable. Generally, as far as the New Testament, and I'm talking about nowadays because we have documentary evidence, in say the 19th century, a lot of these New Testament documents people were going to want to push back to say, or push up to say the early part of the 2nd century or the early 100s. Even the higher critical scholars ain't really doing that now because the documentary evidence is way too early. Like, for instance, it's not debated that John was the last gospel written. We have a manuscript that's at 125 AD. That had to be written pretty early. But generally, scholarly consensus is probably going to put them all somewhere between, I mentioned 49, and most evangelical scholars are going to put the earliest New Testament books probably not any earlier than 49, and generally speaking, 95. As I said, some earlier people wanted to date the Gospel of John later than that, in the early hundreds, but when we got our earliest manuscript from the Gospel of John, that's from 125, and that manuscript had to have time to be copied and make its way all the way to Egypt, that gets pretty weak. You're going to find people who believe the Bible is the Word of God that are going to tend to date the Gospels a little earlier than people who don't believe the Bible is the Word of God because people tend to want to. But here we're talking about mostly the difference. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The difference is like most evangelical scholars are going to put Matthew, Mark, and Luke between AD 60 and 70. A few might put it back in the 50s. A lot of your what we might call higher critical scholars who don't believe the Bible is the Word of God, they might put the Matthew, Mark, and Luke between 70 and 80. But when you get right down to it, that's really not a lot of difference, especially with again, comparing it, if I can make my way back here, especially when you compare it to other stuff. So most evangelical scholars are going to date these before AD 70, the Gospels, but even if you date it, or Even if you date them after AD 70, they're still very, very, very early as ancient documents go. So that most of them were written in the first 70 years of the history of the church isn't really debated by almost anybody. I mean, that would be very fringe to debate that. I should mention that if we're talking about Paul's letters, some people are going to dispute whether Paul wrote all of them, but let me give you a few New Testament books that the most. I'm going to use the word liberal, but I'm not talking about political liberalism. I'm talking about theological liberalism, which is an important difference, all right? I don't want to talk about politics. If you want to talk about politics another time, and let's not. Okay, but, and from theological liberalism, if we're talking about the spectrum of New Testament scholarship, let me give you some letters that nobody denies were written by Paul. I'm talking about the most liberal, the most anti-supernatural scholars are going to agree that some of us would argue that this is potentially the most important document ever written. Those of us who believe the Bible is the Word of God, ain't nobody's denying Paul wrote Romans. Ain't nobody's denying that Paul wrote Galatians. Ain't nobody's denying that Paul wrote and ain't nobody denying that the Apostle Paul, the historical Apostle Paul, wrote 1 Thessalonians. We would call this the undisputed.
Pete, can I just interrupt a second?
Yeah.
Mary, is this focusing on what your actual question was? It seems like your question was part of it. If you had to really condense it into one main area that you want to illuminate, what would it
I think you answered it, because I really wanted to know what the difference
Okay.
was, because I think someone who has faith is going to look at it differently.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the same between the Testaments.
Right.
What they're talking
It's a
about.
very different ball of wax. And some of that is because the Old Testament was written over a period. Well, if you think of it in conservative terms, the Old Testament was written over a period of about maybe 1,250 years, give or take. And there was earlier document traditions that they probably would have leaned on. But the New Testament, very few people are denying that the New Testament was written within 50 years. Almost nobody. The main difference, these documents, very few people are arguing about the date. For instance, Galatians is probably written, the earliest of Paul's letters is probably written in about AD 50 to 51. That's not debated. Romans is probably written in about 55 to 57. That's not debated. So there's a lot of documentary evidence that's really pretty well agreed upon. Where's it going to go? Oh, for instance, Bart Ehrman. We talked about Dr. Bart Ehrman. You can find this on YouTube if you or a Google search. He was on a radio program with some British atheist skeptics who didn't know a lot about history or biblical scholarship. And he starts asking Bart Ehrman about something about he's basically denying that the Apostle Paul ever existed. And Bart Ehrman, who wrote Misquoting Jesus, is like, that's utterly ridiculous. And the guy's like, well, aren't there some historians that believe that the Apostle Paul didn't exist? And Bart Ehrman's like, not real historians. And the guy's like, well, I'm not a historian, but I've heard. And Bart Ehrman kind of cuts him off, and he's like, well, I am, and I'm telling you. He's like, I know personally probably 1,000 historians. None of them, this is, if you're saying things like, did Paul or did Jesus really exist, that kind of stuff, that's fringe scholarship. That's tabloid scholarship. Even if I use the big word, the liberals, even they aren't saying that kind of stuff. Most of it, let me, I know we're running out of time and I want to continue to dialogue as much as anybody wants. But let me give you guys a thought to close up, a couple of thoughts, but a thought on the scholarship and then a thought on, maybe a spiritual thought, because I am a pastor here and I'll want to do that. does the New Testament get put in a special category? Why does it get a level of skepticism that none of these other documents get? Why don't they go after Thucydides and Suetonius and Homer and Plato? Why did people just assume that we know exactly what these guys wrote? And we assume, I don't want to assume that we can't know what the New Testament wrote. It's because the New Testament says things that make demands on your life, and it says things that if they are true, everything changes. If you're a sinner and Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins and rose on the third day, and you need to trust in Him for salvation, and there's eternal ramifications for this, eternal glory with Him, or eternal punishment without Him, people want to get themselves as far away from that being true as possible. So as I say, the question of whether the documents are true is a different question than the question of whether we can know what they really said. But I think that people want to deny that we can know what they said, because that would, I think, make them feel like that's one more step removed from them being true. Because the truth of the matter is, I believe that the scriptures are supernatural in nature. People tend to, let's be honest, people either really want to believe this is the Word of God, or they really don't want to believe this is the Word of God. I mean, I just read Homer's Iliad. If people were going around and worshiping Zeus, I mean, the animal rights people might get a little upset if they start sacrificing oxen and stuff. But other than that, if people were going around worshiping Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite, in the United States of America, most people are going to think, oh, isn't that cute, isn't that sweet, or they're going to think, oh, that's really awesome. How can I get in on that? How do you worship Zeus, right? That's a new movement. Maybe I should jump on that bandwagon. Whereas, they get so uncomfortable with the Bible and its demands because I believe the New Testament tells us who God is and who we are and what that means we need to do. The New Testament says you're a sinner and you're lost apart from a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, and you need to trust Jesus and Jesus alone for salvation if you're going to spend eternity with God. And that's pretty clear. We're going to talk about that in our last session in like 3 or 4 weeks. Unambiguous stuff that is very unpopular with people. So I want to say I really think there's a spiritual dimension to this. I think there are dark spiritual forces that are wanting to lead people away from trusting in the truth of the Scripture. And I think God is calling you to believe and trust that the record He's given of humanity and sin and Himself and His Son becoming man and dying on the cross for our sins and rising again, that's something God wants you to be in contact with. And that's why the Bible is attacked in a way that really no other book really is. If you want to talk more about the Bible's demands on you and how you can be saved, I really think this is something the Bible touches, and I would love to talk to you about that. I believe that you can have eternal life through believing in Jesus, and if you're foggy about how that works, I would love to share more with you about that. Got my man Jay here and the man in black who would also love to share with you. So don't let that go, and don't get so distracted by all this data that you forget that we're really dealing with spiritual matters, and what it really relates to is eternity. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Thanks for the questions. I hope we fielded enough. If you want to chat more, I don't have plans to skedaddle out of here. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for tonight, and I thank you that your word is so well tested, Lord, and I just pray that as we interact with these things, Lord, I pray that anyone who's struggling, that they will see past the scholarship, as important as it is, to the person of Jesus Christ, to His work, to what He accomplished for us, and to our need to come to Him in humility and trust in Him alone. So I just want to lay this at your feet and just ask you for for your grace in these things, and that you'll just, anybody here who's struggling with these matters, that you'll just open their eyes and turn their hearts around. Give you tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.